Good afternoon again, everyone. For those of you who've joined us over the past few weeks, welcome back. If you're new to all of us, then welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue. Si vous avez nous joindre pour notre autre webinaire, merci. Et si c'est votre première fois, très bien. On espère que vous trouvez le valeur aujourd'hui. Today's live stream is a joint effort. It's brought to you on behalf of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association and by the Ivey Academy. Notre événement aujourd'hui, c'est une présentation conjointe par le CVCA et aussi par Ivey. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivey Academy. That's the Learning and Development Wing of Ivey Business School in London. Je suis le chef d'éducation exécutif à l'École de commerce Ivey à l'Université Western en Ontario. We've been impacted like others recently. We're rebooting our own business here, so we're excited to be launching some new virtual programs that are purpose-built for this era, the COVID era. Those programs are now live, along with kind of our tried, tested, and true stuff, which we've converted to virtual and blended delivery. We would invite you to check our website if you want more details. Nous avons été affectés comme tout le monde. Notre réponse des nouveaux programmes virtuels, si vous avez l'intérêt, on vous encourage, s'il vous plaît, visiter notre site web. Here at the Academy, we've talked a lot lately about the responsibility of businesses to the economy and to society, and how in the years leading up to COVID, businesses supported each other, supported one another. They were built and helped to thrive by partners, suppliers, accountants, lawyers, bars, restaurants, print shops. There's a whole ecosystem of players. And about how it's kind of a responsibility to now not use the pandemic as a scapegoat to abandon your ecosystem. We strongly believe that businesses don't get to just tap out right now. That's a cornerstone of corporate responsibility and social responsibility. And there's an obligation to try to get back to work and maneuver through the uncertainty. And I know that topic matters a lot to the CVCA. I know it matters to our guests today. Each of them are thinking hard about leading their way, to get back to business and to keep maneuvering through this, through this period, to be inclusive of their ecosystems and business communities. We've led a lot about supply chains lately. We've probably taken them for granted before. I know we don't now, and so that's what we'll be talking about today. But I will introduce our panelists in a few minutes. I first wanted to welcome Kim Furlong. That's one of our great partners and a close friend of Ivey. Kim is the CEO of Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. Je veux commencer aujourd'hui par introduire Kim Furlong, qui est un partenaire d'Ivey et aussi le chef du CVCA. Kim, I know you think a lot about criticality of supply chains, and you want to say just a few words off the top about our partnership in today's topic.
Merci, Marc, et bonjour à tous. As Marc just said, CVCA and Ivey have been great partners. We began on a journey and really a willingness to build private capital and the strength of people in our space and wanting to enter our space. And we were really excited last year to team up with Ivey to deploy the first ever private capital investment school in Canada, which was a resounding success. And this year, as Mark just said, the events that surround COVID is not an excuse to skip a year, but rather an opportunity to revisit, redesign, and deploy something that will be fresh and interactive and engaging. And we're working on that. And for anyone who's interested in private capital, venture capital or private equity is something that you aspire to know more about or enter or become an investor, I would encourage you to spend more time with both of us. When it comes to supply chains, it's been a question that has been high on our mind. We just on the end of our annual conference, and we had a number of panel sessions last week that spoke about supply chains. Will we see the end of globalization? Will we see local sourcing? Will the North American parameter become what it was envisaged in the years of NAFTA, where we would have an economic region where supply chains would become stronger and more integrated? Will Asia continue to be the source of supply for a company in our growth? So I'm really excited about this panel. I'm thrilled that Ivey reached out to us to partner on this, and I cannot wait to hear the conversation that will ensue. Mark, thank you very much for having me.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks, Kim, and félicitations. Congratulations to you and the CDCA. And we were talking a little bit just before we came on air about how impressive a feat it is. You pulled off your conference in such a short period of time. So congratulations. Let's introduce our guests today. We have another stellar lineup of panelists. So today we're joined by Professor Deishin Lee. Deishin is an associate professor in the operations management and sustainability groups at Ivey. We have Mario Gross with us. Mario is Chief Procurement Officer at LafargeHolcim. He oversees global procurement and some supply chains at LafargeHolcim. He's based in Switzerland. And we have Marcus Larsson with us. Marcus is a partner at Isaac Operations. He heads up the private equity sector. He's known for increasing shareholder value through operational improvements, and was introduced to all of this through CDCA. So, as always, I'm going to moderate. I'll direct traffic a bit, but as always, we have Sean Ackland-Grant with us. He's our executive producer. So, Sean, you wanted to talk a little bit about what's going to go on today?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I hope you're excited about this session. We are. We'll be answering audience questions at a few points throughout the hour. If you have questions, double-click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your window to submit them. You can ask as many questions as you'd like, so don't feel like you have to save them up till the end. If you've joined us before, you actually know that questions submitted early get a bit of an advantage because other viewers can upvote questions they like. So that will push popular questions to the top of the list. So use that thumbs up icon to upvote questions. We'll also make the recording available at iveyacademy.com/blog later today. Thanks, Mark, and let's get things started.
All right, let's get rolling. We always like to start with kind of a current state. Where are we now? Deishin, I was hoping we could start with you. Could you just sort of give us a bit of a balcony view, macro view, impacts on supply chains around the world, and the kind of the movement that we're seeing as we move through the crisis?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Sean and Mario and Marcus. And so indeed, we've heard all these words, adjectives like extraordinary, unprecedented about the COVID pandemic. And these adjectives also apply to the impact on the supply chains. And so, and they apply on several dimensions. First is the scope of the impact on supply chains. And this is worldwide. So previously we've had other regional disruptions, for example, tsunami in Japan or flooding in Thailand or drought in California. Those types of things are obviously very, they're tragic, certainly in terms of humans, but also, the supply chains experience huge disruptions. But there are other regions that can step up and help during those times. And this time, it's everywhere in the world and almost simultaneously. There's some delays, but that's certainly the scope of it. The worldwide scope has increased the challenges, especially across borders as we limit transportation. Another characteristic that I think is quite different about this one is that it's affected the supply side and the demand side. So supply has been disrupted, obviously, due to COVID shutdowns. And then also the demand side, consumers are behaving very differently. Their purchasing patterns are very different. They're at home. And so on one hand, some channels have dried up in terms of the demand and other channels are exploding. So there's no shortage of challenges in this situation, but we are seeing interesting to see how it all shakes out in the interim and also long term, because people are discovering that there are different ways of doing business. And I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity for us.
Thanks. Mario, I wanted to come to you next. I believe LH is in 70 countries, so you've clearly been thinking about this. You've been dealing with everything from interrupted supply chains to actual border closures. Can you just talk a little bit about how you've handled this and how you've thought about it?
Yeah, well, in our building materials business, we basically base it on very, very strong local supply chain footprints. So let's say on the customer delivery side, we are actually locally impacted. That means we are, in that point of view, we are lucky not to have too much finished products traveling over borders, which is a big strength of our business model. On the other hand, of course, it means you have also a very strong inbound supply chain on local base, and then added on in the area of equipments, in the area of mobile transport equipments, where then the global supply chain comes in, where you don't have local supply chains inbound anymore. And accordingly, I think for us, one of the strengths of the model is that we have a very strong local management teams, very strong local empowerment, and which are able to check and basically run the local inbound supply chains. We talk about suppliers, logistics suppliers, and so on, which need to be managed in such a local model in each country, maybe in each vicinity of our plants. So accordingly, we have a very, very close tracking with our suppliers on local scale. On the other hand, for the international supply chains, we have then the global team, which is looking at products which are sourced from overseas, and where then the tracking in the different markets like in China, India, Europe, US comes into place, and where things are getting a little bit more complex. And especially with the pandemic development moving from region to region, you have to be very much up to date and follow what's really happening in these specific markets in order to secure your inbound supply chain.
Marcus, let's come to you. Just kind of current state. What are you hearing from clients? One of the interesting things I thought you said in the prep was you're seeing more and more companies kind of break up contracts to and create diversification to try to manage this. Is that still a trend you're seeing?
Yeah, and so I guess a couple of things. I guess first of all, what are we hearing from our clients? I think we definitely hear the stories of disruption, businesses that need to shut down because demand's dropped off or because of regulations. I think also a lot of additional costs being incurred through the new measures that are being put in place. But I think to me the biggest thing and the most impressive thing that I'm hearing throughout this, and sort of my biggest takeaway, is really how quickly businesses are adapting and figuring stuff out. And I think there's a lot of really impressive people. People put their safety at risk, going to work, showing up at work, or even getting to work, just to keep supply chains moving. And I think we do a lot of work in the Canadian food supply chain. I think it's really impressive, all the additional work and effort and costs that are going into sort of keeping food on our tables. I think in regards to sort of the diversification of the supply chain, I think to me, maybe what we're seeing is that there's been a lot of focus, certainly with a lot of the clients that we work sort of historically, on supply chain efficiency and cost reduction, and maybe not as much on resilience. And so, a lot of the buffers that previously existed around, inventory moving to just in time, consolidation of suppliers for purchasing cost efficiencies, limited surge capacity because you're pushing your assets to the max. It sort of takes away some of the buffers. And so I think in this time, what we're seeing is a lot of clients sort of quickly reacting to that. And so I think some of those examples, it does include diversification of contracts. So I think certainly in the food space, we've probably most of our clients have probably been on the receiving end in terms of certain retailers or certain customers wanting to either break up a contract, which then creates a further disruption into everything that's already going on, or in some cases presents new opportunities because our clients end up being one of the businesses that are being asked to take on the new volume.
Dacian, I know you think about supply chains as they come to food. Marcus just sort of introduced that. And you talked a bit about consumer behavior and not just the supply side, but the demand side too. So, what do you think this means for food supply chain and how we're reacting through this?
Yeah, so it has absolutely had an enormous impact on food supply chains. Food supply chains are particularly vulnerable to disruptions because most of what's the material flowing through is perishable, right? So we can't keep the inventory around like an automobile for months and months and then try to figure out our supply strategy and our distribution strategy. So what's happening, and what happened, I'm sure everybody realized, that all of a sudden, let's say 30% of the food that people consumed outside the home in restaurants and through schools, cafeterias, et cetera, that demand went to zero. And then all of a sudden we were eating almost everything inside our home. And so that food, it's delivered through a distribution channel, which is finely tuned in terms of warehouses, transportation, all these logistics. And suddenly there was a huge swing, and it's very hard for supply chains to adapt to that. And so that's why we're seeing, on the one hand, farmers dumping milk because they don't have the distribution channel to send that material out to. And then on the other hand, we have empty shelves in the grocery stores. And this switch from one channel to the other was so sudden. And so another problem with food supply chains is that it's hard to stop production. So for example, the milk is a good example, that cows don't stop producing milk because people suddenly don't go to school and consume milk during lunch and recess, right? And so there was a lot of food wasted, and I think it still continues. But what we're seeing is it's almost like a capillary system, right? There's veins that carry main arteries and veins that carry food from one source A to B, and then suddenly one of those veins is cut, right? And then now we're seeing like little capillaries trying to get that flow of material to the people that need it. And so there have been, for instances, let's just take restaurants, for instance, used to have dine-in customers. Obviously that shut down for quite a number of weeks. And then they may have adapted in terms of focusing on takeout. I've also heard of restaurants not just doing takeout as in preparing the food, but just selling the ingredients that they're getting. Again, we're getting a lot of goods into our establishment. We have to get them out somewhere. And meanwhile, shredded cheese, for instance, people may not be used to buying, 3-pound bags or 10-pound bags of shredded cheese. But again, it's an adaptation on both the demand side and the supply side. And we're seeing that they're, on both sides, that we're working it out so that there's a way of joining them together. But again, this transition period is really rough, right? Because it's disruption on the supply side and then big changes on the demand side. So on the supply side, for instance, farmers that are reliant on workers that typically come from international, like Jamaica or other places, they may not be able to get into the country, or there's a delay in getting them. And again, the crops don't wait for you to have a worker there to harvest. They come up, and then that window of opportunity is gone. And so what we've seen is there are companies that are adapting. I would say anecdotally, it seems like smaller ones can adapt a little quicker, which seems to make sense. Not because, well, there are some systemic issues, but also there tends to be more regulation when you're at scale. So quotas, which channels you're allowed to sell through, those are determined by regulations. And even if the equipment and the operations were ready, we still have to deal with that regulatory obstacle, well, not obstacle, but something to be managed. Whereas smaller organizations, for instance, CSAs, I'm sure they've seen their businesses bloom. People are looking for fresh produce. If they can't find it in the stores, they're going to be looking for other outlets to get them. So again, just a lot of interesting things going on. This whole notion of globalization versus localization, it's not really clear to me. On the one hand, I would say, yeah, if you can't, your normal supply chain is not working, and you're kind of looking locally to see what's available, it's that they're definitely experiencing a boon in some sectors, but it will also depend on how long this lasts and the processes that we put in place going into the future.
You know, we have a client in the potato business. They make a lot of French fries, and I would say facing exactly kind of what you talked about. You know, off the hop, you think, well, so what if you used to sell a lot to food service? Just, you know, go through retail and sell to consumers. Well, not actually that easy. Logistically, not that easy. Regulatory, not that easy, and yeah, a lot of complexity to navigate through. Marcus, just coming back to you, let's just stay on this point one more time. And you know, I kind of had this question that's shown up a little bit. In fact, it's shown up quite a bit through the chat and the Q&A is around cost. You know, you kind of touched on this, right? It's not inexpensive to make these changes, and to keep your options open. And so, you know, ultimately, who's going to bear the cost increase? Is it going to be on the suppliers, or is it going to get passed through to the clients and then to the consumer?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a great answer. I think what's happening right now, at least what I'm seeing, is that a lot of the I guess a lot of the businesses are keeping the costs or taking on the cost. I think that there's a lot of questions, and I know that there's you know, I think more and more as I guess as we move forward, I think it is going to be something that needs to be figured out, and I think it's going to be a combination of, you know, ultimately, is this cost going to be you know, somehow moved on to the consumers? And I guess maybe we're in a lot of areas where we're getting a bit more involved now too, is how can we start like taking some of that cost out? How can we be more efficient with a lot of these changes that we're putting in place to really pull it out? But like I said, I think I don't have a great answer around where's the cost going to end up.
Mario, let's shift gears a little bit. You've talked to us about the very rapid digitization of your business, and you know how quickly you were able to pull that off. Could you tell that story and talk about what that's meant for LH?
Yeah, I think the building material industry is traditionally maybe a more conservative industry in implementing new technology and so on. However, what we have seen is that coming with the need of and the challenges in the health side, that certain opportunities in the digital area could be implemented much faster, because customers, as well as our suppliers, as well as our own people, saw the need that, for example, with the digitization of delivery papers, which is maybe standard in parcel services and so on, but maybe in deliveries to construction sites, not yet. That in that area we can learn a lot from more advanced industries. And accordingly, as an example, in North America, we've implemented now where we do thousands of deliveries per day onto job sites, where we were able very fast to digitize basically the entire delivery paperwork and the ordering process with our customers, to make sure that we don't have any physical exchange of paperwork anymore, reducing, of course, the risk for the customer, the risk for our lorry driver, as well as the risk for our people inside the plant who do the loading, who do the paperwork. And it's amazing to see how fast you can do these changes if the environment changes so fast and forces you to adapt. And you just see immediately opportunities which for systems which you might have had in the pocket, in the drawer, but were not necessarily viable in normal business operations. But at that point in time, well, that's a moment where you actually see, okay, now is everybody in the chain is willing to go fast and to implement. And I have to admit, I'm very fascinated, especially about the people in our company who have adopted so fast to this new environment. And I think this is maybe one of the biggest learnings, that meetings maybe don't need to be personal all the time. And on the other hand, things can actually be changed very fast.
You talked a little bit there about the how everyone in the chain kind of needs to play ball at the same time. We had a gentleman on who was very senior in the automotive sector, and he said in times where there isn't a crisis or an impetus, often the OEMs will want to move faster than the suppliers or the dealers will, and if they kind of don't, then there's not a lot you can do, because you need the entire ecosystem to change at the same time. Sounds like you had success with that. Was that LH led, or was it kind of everybody came to the conclusion sort of their own accord?
No, I think LH is for that specific case in North America. Yes, LH was a leader because we had the system available. We were anyway planning to roll it out, but now was the moment really to accelerate and to offer our customers immediately a solution which gave them trust in that the operations can go on. And I think looking at the overall at the situation, bringing now this innovative and especially digital solutions, minimizing physical contact between people for such a pandemic is obviously something which is very, very valuable and which is valued from customers throughout the entire supply chain. And I think this is maybe the learning overall, that again, it's a supply chain, and accordingly all parts of the chain have to work in each other and have this understanding. And sometimes you yourself have to be the driver, but sometimes you also got to listen what is brought to you, because there are some very good ideas in place which will improve supply chain efficiency then on top.
As always, we are overwhelmed with questions, so apologies to you out there in space if we don't get to your question. We'll do our best here, and we will provide some follow-up after. But why don't we take a couple of questions now that are coming from the audience? A lot of folks here want to think about the future and talk about the future. That's what the back half of the conversation is going to be, so we'll hold those. But there's a question here about kind of political pressures, and the notion in the question is that there is a move to go toward a kind of a regional strategy for reasons that are fairly obvious. Companies may resist that because that strategy lends itself to other disruption pressures, but maybe overweighted by political pressures. And so, how do you imagine organizations dealing with the political pressure to go regional versus staying global? Happy for any of you to take that one.
Well, Mark, I would probably think it matters the product that we're talking about. For instance, personal protective equipment is probably the foremost thing that everyone's thinking about. Yeah. And probably every country in the world is thinking about their supply chain for this kind of critical equipment that is needed during something like this. It may not be COVID now, but it's something else. So this kind of sort of in national interests, I think these kinds of supply chains will be dealt with differently than the supply chain for water skis, for instance. So I think it's going to be very product specific how much you're thinking about the cross-border difficulties of your supply chain. Maybe Mario or Marcus can speak to more about these other supply chains. And certainly from food, every country already has its own, national supplies and inventory for staple products, and so we're used to that. And now I think there might be a reconsideration to include other types of products as well.
Marcus, I've got a Canada-specific question for you in a second, but Mario, you're a very, very large organization, touch a lot of people, employ a lot of people. I would imagine very important to some governments in lots of countries. Is a political consideration part of your decision set?
I think first of all, for us, it's very important to point out that we have very, very strong local supply chains. Again, our business model is based on local manufacturing. Accordingly, we have a very, very large supplier base around within the geographies we are operating. So the global share of our supply of our inbound supply chain is less than 20%. So you know, I don't think that we are that much exposed to that topic, because we are naturally operating with the local governments. We are in frequent exchange. We are in frequent cooperation to develop. We are in the building material industry. Accordingly, you have also a lot of infrastructure topics which you anyway cooperate together. We have traditionally always cooperated closely with our communities. We have a lot of suppliers which are located around our operations. So as I said, I have to admit, for us, it has been a topic for the entire time of operation, and it's nothing new actually. So, and for the share of the global sourced items, I think it's a question then of actually long-term competitiveness. And long-term competitiveness is not just the price, it's the entire cost of the supply chain. And this is, I think, this kind of evaluation is becoming more and more important. And and we see this daily, basically, if local suppliers, they are very interested in accepting the competition situation, which is a normal part of the business. And they have their strengths with, when you look at the total TCO for the products or services you acquire. And this is, at the end of the day, where they need to be able to compete. And I think that this is not really a new discussion for us, at least.
I would just say anecdotally, like, I don't have much experience in this space, but I speak to some CEOs and senior leaders who, the polite way of putting it, I guess, would be a classic Canadian compromise, and the not so polite way of putting it would be a bit of gamesmanship, where, you know, on the one hand, using a GR play to either placate or to take advantage of sort of new situations around tax breaks or incentives or tariffs, and on the other hand, very much keeping a long-term outlook on global supply chains, kind of hedging their bets. Which, you know, how can you blame someone for taking that approach? Marcus, let's do one more question. This is from our good friend Charles McQuarrie, good friend of the school, who's got a Canada specific question. So he's saying, is Canada a victim to a proportionately lower number of supply options, thinking of pharma and grocery wholesale? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, is Canada proportionally lower supply options? Yeah. Again, probably not in pharma and retail. I don't necessarily have a ton of experience. I think it is true that you know, in Canada we are reliant on a lot of other countries. I mean, obviously US is a strong global you know, strong partner of Canada. So I think I think yes, there probably are sort of disproportionately you know, fewer suppliers. But I think we'll also see what happens throughout this too. And like you said, you know, if you know, as we start looking to you know, the back end of this, and as we're coming out to it, if there's going to be a stronger focus on more regional suppliers, it might open up a bunch of opportunities in Canada.
A good bridge to the territory we want to get into, which is, what does the future hold? None of us are crystal ballers, but Marcus, what are your thoughts on that? Is that what you imagine happens? Is this trend toward regionalization real? Is it gonna hold? What do you expect?
Well, I guess so. I think there's a part there. I guess as we look to the future, I think that there's still a lot of changes to come, and I think it's a bit too early to say how is it all going to play out. I think COVID is likely not going to be going away quickly. And I think the effects are going to continue to linger. And I think, you will see permanent changes in consumer behaviors, and a lot of the safety requirements and social distancing in the workplace, I think, are going to be around for a long time. And so we sort of talked about the cost that brings. So I think what's going to happen is it's probably not going to be a straight sprint to convert to new normal. It's going to be a bit of a winding marathon. And so I think I'd probably be a bit cautious around major changes, but at the same time, I don't think companies should adopt sort of a wait and see mentality. I think the companies sort of before COVID that were really thriving were the businesses that were focusing on keeping the customers happy and have strong financials. And I think I think if anything, I think that's going to be sort of this whole COVID thing is putting more of a magnifying glass on that. And so I think the companies that are able to have a product that the customer wants in the numbers they want in the time that they expect and at a good price and a healthy margin are going to do well. So I think looking at that, I think a big part of that is going to be first and foremost keeping your operations running smoothly. And I think before we sort of get into alternate suppliers and things like that, I think in Canada at least, labor continues to be a major challenge. And I think the responsiveness to the changes in demand, I think is going to be a big one, both in terms of the cost aspect and in terms of the delivery performance. So I think first and foremost, I think that there's going to need to be a lot sort of stronger understanding and visibility of the end-to-end supply chain, and further identification of potential sources for disruptions and the opportunities. And so again, I think it's a bit too early to say is the trend going to be more localized supply chains or more regional supply chains. I think it's going to be a bit of on that particular topic. I think it'll be wait and see. But I do think that companies need to get proactive and sort of work through that process in a systematic way.
Deishin, do you have a view on this?
I absolutely agree that it's a wait and see, as Marcus said. I would tend to see just going back to what we understand about supply chain is that the hallmark of a good, strong supply chain is the partnerships, as Mario said. It's got good partners with your supply chains, and that will. So what we're entering is into an era of high uncertainty, which means if you want to adapt to it, your supply chain has to be flexible. If the entire ecosystem has to change, then the players in that ecosystem have to play nice. They have to get along. They have to work together. They have to collaborate. They have to do give and take. And so I think those companies that have that kind of ecosystem that work well together will be able to adapt to this future of uncertainty. If you have more of a transactional relationship with your suppliers, again, this is really a contractual basis. If you get a lower price and you're going to the next supplier, these kinds of supply chains, I think, will have a harder time adapting, and that might push them towards, or consumers going towards, more localized sources, because the supply will be erratic. And so I think it really depends on the players and where they're located. The additional wrinkle now is that we have this geopolitical dimension to think about now. Before, borders were, we had to deal with borders, but we knew how to deal with them. And now there's an extra wrinkle with transportation, with agreements between governments. And so all of that becomes more complicated. And I think it will put more pressure on companies to think about regionalization, not necessarily for nationalistic reasons, but just for practical, I need to get supply. Companies like Mario's company, obviously for other reasons of weight and transportation, they've already done that. And now we've got another reason to go regional in terms of sourcing supply. The other way, you can deal with uncertainty, classic operations, is inventory. Supply chains are really lean now. We've focused on efficiency, and it's just in time. We don't want to carry inventory, very little excess capacity as well. So I think, at least in the short term, we're going to start not hoarding, but we're going to raise the level above those rocks and, keep inventory, because inventory gives us time to react. Those supply chains that cannot increase their inventory, they are the ones that are going to, the brittleness of it will show earlier. And so, I do think there is going to be some tendency towards regionalization, and to the degree that that happens, again, depends on the product and how we can communicate and work together across the partners in the supply chain, I think.
Mario, I think you were hinting that this is, in a way, this is business as usual for you, but is it business as usual with a heightened importance now?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I was carefully listening to what the colleagues said. I personally think that on the one hand, the topic with the inventory, I think it's going to be tough to run this as an internationally operating company, because you have, at the end of the day, yes, you could do inventories, but of course you have also as a public listed company to deliver targets. And accordingly, in this time of uncertainty, which we see for all kinds of businesses, be it in the automotive industry or food, or just look at tourism, aviation industry, and so on, I'm not sure if hoarding inventory is the right decision, because you hoard cash. And from that point of view, I think there must be a very clear balance for companies. You need to decide which part of your supply chain is so critical that you can afford to do the cash hoarding. And this is a bit, I think, something that needs to be considered when we look at the inventory topic. I personally think that for supply chains, it's maybe now, let's say, supply chains which are very, very much focused on global supply chains, they will have the trend to look more for local or regional opportunities now, but not in the sense of to move from one dependency to another dependency, more in terms of enriching the supply sources to create more flexibility and to be more reactive. And I think this is actually the overall outcome, is that you will move away most likely from single sourcing and move more into dual or triple sourcing in certain areas, because you will not be able to predict actually very fast what will happen. On the other hand, you still have, as company, the total exposure to competitiveness, which every business has. So you cannot really rely on, I don't think that you can move from one into the other extreme. I think it's now the time exactly to balance out, to be very clear about which of your supply chains offer which supply opportunities. And I think it's a very important time also to speak with your supply partners and agree on deleveraging risk for both, because a supply relationship is also a responsibility for the supplier. And if you go into an open communication and agree that deleveraging this risk together makes maybe even sense. So from that point of view, I think it's very difficult and very specific, business by business, how the reaction will look like. But I'm very sure that very global supply chains will tend to find local and regional sources on top, while very local supply chains, if you have a local single source and this business is impacted by whatever it is, we see sometimes very sporadic, very specific outbreaks in one plant. So if you only have this as single source, that can also not be the solution. So accordingly, this kind of businesses who are very, very local single source, they might even go into regional sourcing in order to deleverage the risk.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things strike me through this. It was one thing when all the borders, effectively, all the borders were closed. It's a very different thing when in the future, some are closed and some aren't, and it's hard to predict which ones will and won't. The other thing that strikes me is, supplier councils used to be a thing, and they sort of went out of vogue and went out of favor for a while. And industry associations in various industries and countries have more or less influence, but you could imagine where supplier councils and industry associations play much stronger roles going forward than they maybe have been over the last few years. We've managed to go 46 minutes without talking about China. And China has been such a sort of dominant part of this conversation for 20 years now. Is there kind of a gravitational mass to China that we should be thinking about here as we talk about working through these issues? No, nobody wants to weigh in on this one. Dacian, do you want to take this one?
So are you saying our dependence on China as a manufacturer of many goods?
Yeah, the world's dependence as a manufacturer of so many things.
Yes, certainly. Like again, I guess the poster child example would be personal protective equipment right now, which is almost most of it is, if not, like a huge percentage of it is produced in China. And again, for these critical products, I think every government is looking at the risk that is involved. Now, again, I completely point well taken about Mario is we don't want to increase inventory because that ties up our cash. But there are some things where we again, part of the problem with the personal protective equipment is that we didn't have the inventory we should have had, not necessarily Canada, but North America. And so, we teach that inventory is one of the last resorts. It's something that you keep around because you're masking inefficiencies in your operation. But I think for some items, medical equipment, for instance, if you can't immediately figure out a way to diversify your supply sources, then inventory is an option. And I think that's probably going to be something that every government starts doing immediately for medical equipment. And then the long term, how do we establish supply chains that are less dependent on one particular country, one particular region of the world? That will be a longer term process, but it's already happening, right? Because there's, in the crisis of the COVID, there have been companies stepping up, like we can transform our assembly line, we can transform our manufacturing line to produce hand sanitizers, produce, face masks, 3D printing. So these innovations have been popping up, and now we're going to be into the settling down stage of what's going to be happening long term, and what's the strategy, the sourcing strategy in the long term.
Over the years, I've done a lot of work with a province on the East Coast around the idea of nearshoring, where they were trying to work with organizations who had tried offshoring, had some success, but maybe didn't realize the full level of savings that they were looking for. There were hidden costs and time delays and some hassle factors. And I don't know if does anyone have a view on, does this lead us toward, more of a trend toward nearshoring or backshoring, as we work our way through this? Marcus, I don't know if you have a view on this.
Yeah, I guess it's like I still go back to it. I think some of those things it's a little bit too early to tell. What's going to happen. You know, again, I think that, you know, like's been said, there probably are going to be some sort of trends around localization or regionalization, but again, I think there probably are a couple of other factors, you know, short term to work through. I think, you know, short term, I think the managing cost again is going to be one of the bigger factors, and I think you know, just keeping, like, minimizing disruption. So I think that there's still a lot of firefighting, still a lot of changes, and I think that, you know, longer term trends that we'll see.
It's a question that's right here in the chat, right? Is cost at the end of the day still going to be the determining factor when you're thinking about sourcing, multi-sourcing? You know, it's, if I were to kind of summarize the views I think we have here, yes, with a big caveat, and the caveat is yes, but maintaining better flexibility than we've probably had over the last 10 years would allow you to make some decisions to eat into that cost decision a little bit, at least. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I think maybe jumping in again, I think so too. I think exactly like you said, with that caveat, because I think in the end, the companies that thrive are the ones, you know, that also deliver to their customers, and so you know, cost is absolutely important. But again, I think there's going to be probably more of a consideration, sort of the cost and resilience, or cost and flexibility.
Yeah, I think. Okay, sorry, Deishin. Just to add on, I think what's getting maybe even more important now than it was before is the control of the pre-supply chains. So in many industries already, you actually look at what your suppliers, pre-suppliers are, etc. And I think this becomes even more important now to understand that, because I strongly believe it, let's say, localizing or regionalizing is not necessarily the solution if the pre-supply chain is then still dependent on international or on global supply chains, because you just divert the problem, or you relocate the problem. But and I think for supply chain specialists and for procurement teams and technical teams all over the world, it will be much more important even than before to understand what is actually the operational business of your supplier, and what is the risk involved in his supplier base, etc. And the cost topic will always be a significant part of the decision. But I think even today and before crisis, there were always other factors that needed to be considered. And I think one more time we have been made very clear how important it is to understand your supply chain in depth.
Mary, you just introduced the idea of the teams behind this, the people making the decisions. There are two interesting questions here in the Q&A about talent and whether the skill sets that we will be looking for in supply chain professionals are going to be different going forward. You know, you can imagine at one point in time anyway, you know, a really strong negotiation skills with sort of an operational mindset was important. But do you imagine new skills being in demand and being hired for?
Well, I think first of all, my biggest learning out of this time is the importance of speed and trust, actually, because I think for us, the biggest strength of our operating model is that we have very strong country and local management teams who run this business. And the same is for my procurement organization. Most of the decisions are taken place in countries. And accordingly, I think the strengths we need now is when we talk about regional or global managers, they need to be able to trust and to delegate. I think this is something which is a big topic, which I personally see every day. I just took over in January this role and basically jumped right into the crisis. So my team and me, we needed to get adjusted to each other. And I think this is a future model. The second topic is a much more, especially for supply chain people, I don't think that supply chain specialism is the needed thing. I think it's more the generalist topic who understands risks throughout the supply chain as well as impact for the own business. And to have then the combination with the topic of speed and actually agility or flexibility is because the approach, when I look at the last 6 months, how fast we had to change approaches, how fast we had to adapt also our management styles, how fast we had to take decisions, because you cannot do 20 meetings in order to take a decision.
Yeah.
So accordingly, and then you have to do all this via video and trust the person who is sitting in front of you, which you might never have met before in person. I think this kind of skills will have to will play a much bigger role than in the past.
We don't have a lot of time left, as usual. We didn't get to everything that we were trying to cover, but those are I thought some pretty good closing thoughts from Mario. Maybe Marcus, to you, any closing thoughts or words of advice for the audience?
Well, I guess for me, I think I started off talking about how impressed I've been with the frontline people, and I think the sort of the human response throughout all this. So I think that there's probably to me, I think that there's a big part which is around how do you channel that energy, that drive to into improving the delivery and managing cost, and I think those are going to be the two things. So I think, and then probably the last thing is, and I think most businesses are already doing this, but it's, get proactive and get structured.
Dacian, how about you? Closing thoughts or advice?
Just want to echo what Mario said about trust in the supply chain. As we face times of uncertainty, we don't know what's around the corner. The agility, flexibility, it's going to be the most flexible resource that any company has is its human capital. And that's what's going to pull you through. If you have competent, capable people who are willing and able to work with supply chain partners, they are the most valuable resource.
Just excellent insight from all of you. I'll wrap it up here in a second, but Sean, can you remind everyone what happens from here?
Sure. So we will post the full recording on our YouTube channel at the Ivey Academy, as well as on our website, iveyacademy.com/blog. You can look for that later today. Feel free to share it, and also visit us at iveyacademy.com/events to register for future upcoming live streams.
Okay, well then, I think we'll leave it there. That what I took away from this was the answer is yes. The answer to all of these questions is yes. Right? Will we stay global? Yes. Will we go more regional? Yes. Do we need to manage cost? Yes. Do we need to be flexible? Yes. That's a tough order, a tall order for managers out there making decisions. But I just appreciate all of you making time today. Mario, I know you're many hours ahead of us, so thank you for staying late and doing this. And Dacian and Marcus, just excellent insights. Thanks again to Kim and to CVCA for being such great partners. For all of those of you who are tuning in, we are taking a week off next week, so we'll be back the week of the 6th. Cheers, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.